We're now going to look at higher order functions, and this follows fast on the heels of our discussion of references. And that's because a higher order function is one that gets passed by reference to another function or returned from another function. We'll get to that in 1 second. Let's look and review what we learned about references. The idea that every value in Python is stored in memory and that every variable is a name that points or refers to that value. So that if we say y equals x, we're not actually saying that y should be equal to a list that x is equal to, not a copy, but instead assign a memory address. In other words, when we first assign a list to x, we're assigning a memory address. It doesn't look like it, but it is. It's assigning a memory address where this list can be found. And then when we assign x to y, we're doing the same thing. We're assigning a memory address. It's the same memory address that x points to. And we brought out that diagram saying that saying b equals a is not saying b is equal to a new 5. What it's saying is it's equal to the same 5 that a is equal to, or more accurately, that b points to a value that a also points to. So we take this one step further by talking about functions. Here's the thing about functions. They don't seem like it, but functions are data. Or better said, a function is a data value in the same way that an int or string or list is a value. A function is a data value. Now, this is another kind of mind-bending concept because heretofore we haven't really thought about a function as a data value. We think of a function as a series of instructions. In other words, we think of it as a block of code. And of course, for our purposes, it is. But now we're actually going to need to think of it as a data value. In other words, we've been looking at a number of types. In any study of introductory Python, we begin by looking at the types, and we say that the types are int, float, string, list, set, tuple, dict, file, none type, Boolean. Those are the types that I usually, or that I bring up in the introductory Python class. And of course, we see other ones as well, maybe ones like a CSV reader object or a CSV reader object, for example. And then, of course, other objects like multidimensionals or maybe a database handle, a database connection object, a database cursor object. There are many, many different kinds of objects. But there's one that we've kind of overlooked when talking about basic core Python, the core objects that we work with every day. Because there's one other one, and it's the function. Function is an object. It's a data value, it's an object, it's really the same as any of the others. Of course it behaves differently, but you know, of course, that every object behaves differently from other objects. Integers and strings behave differently. Lists and sets behave differently. Certainly lists are different than integers. Every object has its own behavior, its own nature, its own reason for being. And the function is no different. What makes a function different, of course, is that you can call it, that when you call it, it executes its code. And so it makes it seem sort of like a statement or like some other kind of structure within Python that's not necessarily an object, but it is. It's an object. A function is a data value of a particular type, and thus it is an object. We can say a function is a data value of a particular type, i.e., an object. In the same way that a string or a list or an integer is an object. or are objects. Okay, so what does that mean to you and me? It means that we can think of a function as a data value that can be assigned, that can be placed inside of lists or dictionaries, that can be passed to functions. We can do whatever we want with a function in the same way we can do whatever we want with one of these data values. The simplest thing we could do is assign. Now I want you to remember what we said about references in our review just prior to this, and also in our discussion of references. When we do an assignment, what are we assigning? What are we assigning? What are we actually assigning to Y? Well, by definition, you can say that we are assigning a reference. Just as when I said that if you say B equals A, you're assigning a reference to B, so are we assigning a reference to Y. But what are we assigning a reference to? What is greet? You say greet is a function, yes. But I think more tellingly or a little deeper, it's to say that greet is pointing to a function object. So think of it as the same as int, float, string, list, set, tuple, dict, file, none, bool. Think of it as the same as those. It happens to be very different in nature, but that doesn't make it any less an object. And it doesn't make assignment any less an assignment by reference to point to that object in memory. You see, when we define a function, we're storing values in memory in the same way that we assign, let's say, a list or an integer to a name. We're assigning a data value to that name. It's almost as if we were saying greet equals def, and that would make it a lot clearer. Greet equals def, let's say, and then print hello, etc. Think of it as a value. Think of it as a value in memory, just like integer, float, string, etc., that gets assigned to greet. It would make it a lot more straightforward if it were written this way. When it's written this way, it seems to be a kind of a different entity. And of course it is different, but that doesn't make it less of an object. And this doesn't make it less of an assignment to a name. This is actually an assignment. Greet equals. That's really what we're saying. Greet equals this function. So then what are we doing then when we say Y equals greet? We are assigning a reference to the function object, to Y. A pointer to the function object in memory. Okay, that means that we can call this function through Y. We can call this function through Y because Y also points at the function. Now look at this diagram again and imagine that 5 were a function definition with a whole bunch of statements in it. That's data too. That's a data object as well. And we are now pointing a second name at that object. That's why we can call it through the second name. Now, when we move from there to our next statement here, we have other examples of doing the same thing. But now we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to do another thing that we can always do with objects. We are going to pass a function to another function. So let's take call it and pass it greet. And then in call it, let's call func. Now this is where it starts to get pretty interesting and maybe a little mind-bendy. You need to assemble a number of concepts that we've just brought across. First, the idea of references. and the idea that every value in memory is stored in a separate place and is pointed to by a name, and that multiple names can point to that value. And next, that functions are objects. Functions are data values. And so when we assign one function name to another function name, we're simply assigning that reference to that new name. The next step in this understanding is the idea that you could pass a function as an argument. What are we passing when we pass greet? Note that we are not calling greet. That was something to note in the prior one as well. We're not calling greet here. If we were calling greet, we would be assigning the return value of greet to y, but we're not. We're assigning a reference from greet to y. So now we're passing greet. We're passing greet to call it. So what is func then? Well, I think we can say visually that func is equal to greet. If func is equal to greet, and greet is a function, then func is pointing at that function. And so we can call greet through func. Sometimes when my output is the same, I like to change it and make sure. Now again, this is a bit mind-bendy, but I'm going to explain how you should think of it. We begin at line 12. As always, when we're analyzing functions, we start with the function call, and we ask what is the value being passed. It's greet, and greet is a function object. We then jump up to line 5, because we just called call it, and we passed it a variable, and now func holds the variable. Or I should say we passed it an object through this variable, and we can now say that func is a variable that points to that same object. Func points to greet. So we should be able to call func. We should be able to call the greet function through the name func. Absolutely, and we can. This is the beginning of our understanding of a higher order function. A higher order function is a function that accepts another function as argument or returns a function as return value. So what do you think? I don't know if it reminds you of anything, because there is something that we've been looking at lately that actually makes use of a higher order function. And that is sorting. In this example, we're taking charlist, which has letters. You may remember this from the complex sorting. We're taking these letters, which are sortable, but they're not going to sort alphabetically unless we do something to each one for sorting purposes. And we are passing the name of a function as argument. Now what this is doing, of course,